Chapter 1. The Noble Facade. Antonio Noble stood at the window of his suburban home, watching his neighbor Harold Turner struggle with his broken lawnmower. To any observer, Antonio appeared to be just another middle-aged businessman, successful, settled, and content with his quiet life in Riverside Heights. But appearances, as Antonio knew better than most, were the deadliest weapons of all. At 45, Antonio had perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. His neighbors knew him as a security consultant who traveled frequently for work. What they didn't know was that security consulting was code for 20 years of black operations across 3 continents, where Antonio had earned a reputation that made hardened mercenaries cross themselves when they heard his name whispered in dark corners. The sound of heels clicking on hardwood pulled him from his thoughts. Amber Noble entered the kitchen, her auburn hair catching the morning light. At 38, she remained stunning, the kind of woman who turned heads at the country club. She'd been a real estate agent when they met 12 years ago, selling him the very house they now shared. "Coffee's ready," she said, not looking at him as she busied herself with her phone. Antonio studied his wife with the same analytical precision he'd once used to assess enemy positions. 3 months ago, he'd noticed the subtle changes, the way she angled her phone away from him, the new perfume she claimed was a gift from her sister, the delayed responses to his messages. In his former life, such details meant the difference between mission success and a shallow grave. "Anthony called," Amber said, still not meeting his eyes. "He wants to have dinner tonight. Says he has something important to discuss." Their son, 22 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in criminal justice and dreams of following in the footsteps of his hero, Police Chief Frank McCarthy. Antonio had watched with growing concern as Anthony became increasingly distant, especially after joining McCarthy's unofficial mentorship program 6 months ago. "Did he say what about?" Antonio asked, accepting the coffee cup with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Career stuff, probably. You know how much he looks up to Chief McCarthy." The name hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Frank McCarthy, 51 years old, divorced, and Riverside Heights Golden Boy police chief. The man who'd cleaned up the department, reduced crime by 30%, and somehow managed to be at every community event with his perfectly pressed uniform and politician's smile. Antonio had done his homework on McCarthy within a week of Anthony's first mention of him. Vietnam veteran, 25 years on the force, reputation for being tough but fair. On paper, McCarthy was everything a father would want in his son's mentor. But Antonio had learned long ago that paper lied, and men like McCarthy often hid their darkest impulses behind badges and commendations. "I'll make reservations at Romano's," Antonio said, already planning to use dinner as reconnaissance. "The usual booth?" Amber nodded, finally looking at him. For a split second, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just the weight of whatever secret she was carrying. In that moment, Antonio felt a familiar coldness settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced moments before eliminating targets who'd betrayed their own people. The front door slammed, and Anthony appeared in the kitchen, all 6'2" of him radiating the confidence of youth. He had Antonio's dark hair and strong jaw, but Amber's green eyes and quick smile. Seeing him now, Antonio felt a pang of genuine sadness. Whatever was coming, whatever betrayal was brewing in his perfect suburban life, it would destroy the family he'd tried so hard to build after leaving his old life behind. "Morning, Dad." "Mom." Anthony grabbed an apple from the bowl, his police academy ring catching the light. "I can't stay long. Chief McCarthy wants to see me this morning." "Everything all right?" Antonio asked, his voice carefully neutral. "More than all right," Anthony grinned. "I think he's finally going to offer me that position with the department, under his direct supervision." The pieces clicked into place with mechanical precision. McCarthy wasn't just mentoring Anthony, he was recruiting him. And from the looks passing between Amber and their son, this recruitment extended far beyond professional development. "That's wonderful news," Antonio said, meaning none of it. "Your mother and I are very proud." After Anthony left, Antonio retreated to his home office and activated the secure communication system hidden behind his filing cabinet. Within minutes, he was connected to his old handler, a man known only as Control. "Ghost protocol activation," Antonio said into the encrypted line. "I need a deep background check on Frank McCarthy, Riverside Heights PD. and I need surveillance equipment. The invisible kind. Antonio. Control's voice carried surprise. You've been dark for 3 years. What's the situation? Personal security breach. Family unit compromised. A pause. In their world, family unit compromised meant either extraction or elimination protocols. Control had worked with Antonio long enough to know he didn't make such requests lightly. Equipment drop in 6 hours. Usual location. And Antonio? If you're coming out of retirement, you know there's no half measures. Antonio hung up and stared at the family photo on his desk. Amber's smile seemed different now, and Anthony's expression carried shadows he'd been too blind to see. He'd spent 20 years killing to protect strangers' freedoms, and now he was going to have to destroy his own family to protect himself. But first, he needed to know exactly how deep the betrayal ran. Chapter 2. Beneath the surface. The surveillance equipment arrived exactly when promised. A briefcase full of devices that would make the NSA jealous, delivered by a jogger who paused to tie his shoe near Antonio's mailbox. By evening, Antonio had transformed his home into a listening post that would capture every whisper, every phone call, and every secret his family thought they were hiding. Dinner at Romano's revealed more than Amber and Anthony intended. Antonio watched his wife and son exchange glances across the table, their conversation peppered with careful omissions and loaded pauses. They discussed Anthony's future with the police department, but the subtext was clear. They were planning something that required Antonio to be out of the picture. Chief McCarthy thinks I have real potential, Anthony said, cutting into his steak with more force than necessary. He says the department needs young blood, people who aren't afraid to make hard decisions. Hard decisions, Antonio repeated, noting how his son couldn't meet his eyes. What kind of hard decisions? You know, Dad, sometimes you have to choose between what's legal and what's right. The words hit Antonio like ice water. It was a philosophy he'd lived by for 2 decades, but hearing it from his son's mouth felt like watching a snake shed its skin. This wasn't the boy he'd raised. This was someone else. Someone shaped by Frank McCarthy's influence. Your father's right to be concerned, Amber interjected, her hand finding Antonio's across the table. The gesture felt rehearsed, hollow. Police work is dangerous. More dangerous than Dad's job? Anthony challenged. At least I won't be traveling all the time, leaving my family behind. The accusation stung because it held truth. Antonio's cover required frequent trips, sometimes lasting weeks. He'd missed birthdays, anniversaries, school plays, all in service of missions that kept people like his family safe. Now that sacrifice was being used as a weapon against him. That night, while Amber slept beside him, Antonio lay awake listening to the audio feeds from the surveillance devices. At 2:17 a.m., Amber's phone buzzed with a text message. Through the micro camera he'd installed in her phone case, Antonio watched her read, "Tomorrow night. The cabin. Everything's ready. F." She typed back quickly. Antonio suspects something. Maybe we should wait. The response came immediately. No more waiting. 24 hours and you'll be free. Trust me. Antonio felt something die inside his chest. Not his heart, but whatever part of him had believed in family, in love, in the possibility of a normal life. They weren't just planning to leave him. They were planning to kill him. The next morning brought a phone call that completed the picture. Anthony answered on the first ring, his voice hushed as he spoke to someone Antonio's equipment identified as Frank McCarthy. The cabin's prepared, Anthony said. Remote location, no neighbors for miles. Once it's over, Mom and I disappear for a few weeks. Let things cool down. And you're sure you can handle this? McCarthy's voice carried authority and something darker, satisfaction. He's your father. He stopped being my father the day I learned what kind of man he really is, Anthony replied with a coldness that chilled Antonio to the bone. Besides, after tomorrow night, he'll just be another casualty of his dangerous lifestyle. Antonio realized they knew about his real job. Somehow, they'd discovered his past, and instead of being proud or grateful, they saw it as justification for murder. In their minds, Antonio Noble, the Black Ops operative, was a threat to be eliminated, not a protector to be respected. The final piece fell into place when Antonio intercepted a call between Amber and her sister, Dolores McDermott. Are you sure about this, Amber? Dolores asked. Marriage counseling might. There's no counseling our way out of this. Amber cut her off. You don't understand what he's capable of. The things I've seen in his files, the photos. Frank says men like Antonio never really retire. They just find new targets. But Anthony's his son. Anthony knows what has to be done. Frank's helped him see that some people are too dangerous to live normal lives. After tomorrow, we'll have the insurance money and Frank's protection. We can start over. Insurance money. They weren't just planning murder. They were planning to profit from it. The suburban wife and police chief had crafted the perfect crime. Eliminate the dangerous husband and make it look like his violent past had finally caught up with him. That afternoon, Antonio made his own preparations. He activated dormant protocols, reached out to old contacts, and began moving pieces into position for a game his family didn't know they were playing. If they wanted to see what Antonio Noble was truly capable of, he would give them a demonstration they'd never forget. As evening approached, Antonio received the call he'd been expecting. "Honey." Amber's voice was perfectly modulated, concerned but not overly emotional. "Anthony wants to show you something at the old hunting cabin. Father-son bonding time," he said. "Can you meet us there around 8? "Of course," Antonio replied, already checking the gear bag he'd prepared. "I'll see you both there." After hanging up, Antonio allowed himself one moment of genuine emotion. Grief for the family that had never really existed, rage at the betrayal he should have seen coming, and something darker, anticipation for what was about to unfold. They thought they were predators cornering wounded prey. They had no idea they'd just invited an apex predator to dinner. Chapter 3: The Web Titans. The abandoned hunting cabin sat like a malignant tumor in the Virginia woods, 40 miles from Riverside Heights. Antonio had been there twice before, once for a department picnic when Chief McCarthy had proudly shown off his weekend retreat, and once for Anthony's 18th birthday when his son had insisted on a camping trip like the old days. Now, as Antonio drove through the gathering dusk, he understood why McCarthy had chosen this location. No cell towers, no neighbors, no witnesses. The perfect place for a murder disguised as an accident. His earpiece crackled with Control's voice. "Perimeter team in position. Drone surveillance active. We count 3 heat signatures in the cabin, 2 vehicles." "Copy," Antonio murmured, checking his gear one final time. Hidden beneath his jacket was enough firepower to level a small building, but for tonight's work, he preferred subtlety. The blade sewn into his boot would be sufficient, both for cutting bonds and for more intimate purposes. Through the trees, warm lights spilled from the cabin windows, creating an almost welcoming scene. Antonio could picture them inside. Amber pacing nervously, Anthony checking the chains one more time, McCarthy reviewing their plan with the cold professionalism of a predator. They thought they'd accounted for every variable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Antonio parked his car in the designated spot and walked toward the cabin, every step measured and deliberate. His hands remained visible, his posture relaxed, the picture of a man walking into what he believed was a family gathering. Inside his chest, his heart beat with the steady rhythm of a man who'd walked into hundreds of ambushes and walked out of every one. "Dad," Anthony's voice called from the porch, bright with false enthusiasm. "Great timing. Chief McCarthy was just telling us about his latest investigation." Antonio climbed the wooden steps, noting the accelerated breathing patterns of the 3 people waiting for him. Fear had a smell, and the cabin reeked of it. Not fear of him, but fear of what they were about to do. "Frank," Antonio nodded to the police chief, who stood near the fireplace in civilian clothes. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Last-minute invitation," McCarthy replied, his hand resting casually near his service weapon. "Anthony thought it would be good for us to have a man-to-man conversation." "About what?" Antonio asked, stepping fully into the cabin. Behind him, he heard Anthony move to block the door. "About truth," Amber said from the corner, her voice steadier than he'd expected. "About who you really are, Antonio. What you've done." So they were going to monologue. In Antonio's experience, people planning murder always felt compelled to explain themselves, as if justification could cleanse them of blood. He decided to let them talk while his team moved into final position. "I don't know what you mean," he said, injecting just enough confusion into his voice to encourage them. "Don't." McCarthy stepped forward, his authority on full display. "We know about your real job. The kills. The countries that have your picture on their most wanted lists. Did you really think we wouldn't find out?" Antonio felt genuine curiosity now. "How?" "Your security clearance renewal," Anthony said from behind him, and Antonio heard the distinctive sound of chains being readied. I pulled your file as part of my police academy research project. Imagine my surprise when I discovered my father was an international assassin. Clever. Using official channels to research him would have triggered alarms, but embedding it in a legitimate academic project provided cover. Antonio was almost proud of his son's ingenuity. Almost. The question, McCarthy continued, is what we do with that information. You're a threat to national security, Antonio. To your own family. Men like you don't retire. You just find new targets. So you decided to eliminate the threat, Antonio said, understanding flowing through him like cold water. How very patriotic of you. It's not personal, Amber said, and for the first time, her voice cracked. You have to understand, we know what you're capable of. The insurance policy calls it death by misadventure. Your dangerous lifestyle finally caught up with you. Antonio nodded slowly, processing the full scope of their plan. They'd researched his background, prepared the location, arranged the insurance payout, and recruited his own son to ensure the crime would never be investigated. It was, he had to admit, a well-crafted operation. One question, he said, turning to face Anthony. When did you stop being my son? Anthony's face hardened, the young man replaced by something older and colder. When I realized you raised me to be just like you. A killer. Chief McCarthy helped me understand that I could choose a different path. By becoming a killer anyway? By protecting innocent people from monsters like you. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In that moment, Antonio realized his son was already lost, not just to McCarthy's influence, but to a twisted sense of righteousness that would destroy him from within. He'd become exactly what he claimed to despise, just with a badge to make it legal. Well then, Antonio said, reaching slowly for his jacket pocket. I suppose there's nothing left to. The tranquilizer dart hit him in the neck before he could finish the sentence. McCarthy's backup plan. Of course. Why risk a struggle when chemistry could do the work? Antonio's last conscious thought was appreciation for his enemy's thoroughness. When he awoke, the cabin was on fire. The chains around his legs were military grade, the kind used for prisoner transport. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. Through the growing flames, he could see three figures outside the window. Amber, Anthony, and Frank McCarthy, watching their handiwork with varying degrees of satisfaction and horror. The heat will do the work. Anthony's voice carried through the window, and Antonio heard his own son smile with the words, less mess. Finally, this loser is gone. As they turned to walk away, Antonio felt the last vestiges of fatherly love die in his chest, replaced by something far more dangerous, the cold, calculating fury of a predator who'd been betrayed by his own pack. They thought they'd killed Antonio Noble, the suburban security consultant. They had no idea they'd just awakened something much worse. His fingers found the hidden blade sewn into his boot, and through the smoke, he triggered the emergency beacon that would bring his team down on this place like the wrath of God. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 4. From Ashes, Vengeance. The blade cut through the zip ties with surgical precision. 20 years of muscle memory guiding Antonio's hands even as smoke filled his lungs and flames licked at the cabin walls. The chains around his legs required more creativity. He wrapped his jacket around the links and struck them against the cabin's ironwood stove, using leverage and controlled force until the metal gave way. Outside, he could hear car engines starting. They were leaving him to burn. Antonio's earpiece had been damaged in the fall, but the emergency beacon in his boot was still transmitting. Through the roar of flames, he heard the distinctive whine of rotors approaching, his extraction team, coming in fast and loud. The cabin's rear window exploded outward as Antonio dove through it, rolling into the forest beyond just as the main support beam collapsed. Behind him, the structure that was meant to be his funeral pyre became a blazing monument to his family's betrayal. The helicopter touched down in a clearing 50 yards away, its spotlight cutting through the smoke like a sword of judgment. Antonio recognized the pilot, Eric Miller, call sign Prophet, and the sniper in the passenger seat, Wade Mora, known as Ghost. Both men had served with Antonio in operations that officially never happened. Boss. Eric's voice crackled through the helicopter's comm system as Antonio climbed aboard. What's your status? Operational, Antonio replied, accepting the gear bag Wade handed him. How long have you been watching? Long enough to get full surveillance on the targets, Wade said, his voice carrying the flat emotion of a professional killer. 3 vehicles left the scene. We've got tracking on all of them. As the helicopter lifted off, Antonio watched the cabin burn below them. In the flames, he could see the ashes of his old life. The man who'd believed in family, who'd thought love could overcome any obstacle, who'd been naive enough to trust the people closest to him. That man was dead. What remained was something his enemies should have remembered from his files. Antonio Noble never left witnesses. Control wants a full debrief, Eric said as they banked toward the extraction point. But first, he's got intelligence you'll want to see. 20 minutes later, they touched down at a remote airfield where Control waited with the kind of smile that meant someone was about to die badly. At 63, Control still carried himself like the special forces operator he'd once been, though his wars were now fought with information and influence rather than bullets and blades. Welcome back to the world, Antonio, Control said as they walked toward a waiting vehicle. Though I have to say, your family's timing couldn't have been worse. Meaning? Frank McCarthy, your wife's boyfriend, isn't just a small-town police chief. He's been on our radar for 2 years as a potential asset for foreign intelligence services. The man's dirty, Antonio, not just personally, but professionally. They drove in silence to a safe house where Control had prepared a comprehensive briefing. What Antonio learned in the next hour transformed his personal vendetta into something far more significant. Frank McCarthy hadn't just seduced his wife and corrupted his son. He'd been using his position as police chief to facilitate a human trafficking operation that stretched from Virginia to the Canadian border. Amber's real estate business had been providing safe houses, while Anthony's police academy connections had given them advance warning about law enforcement activities. Your family wasn't just planning to kill you for insurance money, Control explained, spreading photographs across the table. They needed you gone because your security clearance made you a threat to their operation. One background check from you would have exposed everything. Antonio studied the surveillance photos. McCarthy meeting with known cartel representatives. Amber showing properties to men who matched human trafficking profiles. Anthony providing information that had allowed 3 separate smuggling operations to avoid police detection. How long? Antonio asked. Best estimate? About 18 months. Your wife started the affair first, but it became operational quickly. McCarthy needed legitimate business fronts, and Amber's real estate license provided perfect cover. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. This wasn't just adultery. It was treason, human trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder, all wrapped in the flag of his son's misguided sense of justice. What's the official position? Antonio asked. Officially, you died in that cabin fire. Antonio Noble, security consultant, is buried and gone. Control's smile turned predatory. Unofficially, you're now a ghost asset with unlimited operational authority. Your targets have committed crimes against national security, which makes them fair game for termination. Antonio felt the familiar weight of purpose settling on his shoulders. For 3 years, he'd tried to be a normal man, a suburban husband and father. Now he remembered why that had never worked. Normal men didn't have the skills necessary to hunt monsters. What assets do I have? Everything you need, Control replied. Safe houses, weapons, intelligence support, and a kill authorization signed by people whose names you'll never know. Your targets think they've eliminated a threat. Instead, they've created something much worse. Over the next 6 hours, Antonio planned his revenge with the methodical precision that had made him legendary in the intelligence community. This wouldn't be a simple assassination. It would be a systematic destruction of everything his betrayers had built, everyone they loved, and every dream they'd dared to hold. Frank McCarthy thought he was a clever police chief playing with amateurs. He was about to learn what happened when you betrayed a professional killer. Amber believed she'd found freedom and financial security in her lover's arms. She was about to discover that some cages were built from bones and blood. Anthony had chosen his path when he'd chosen to see his father as a monster rather than a protector. Soon, he would learn the difference between the two. But first, Antonio needed to let them think they'd won. Dead men, after all, cast no shadows, right up until they rose from their graves to collect what was owed. Chapter 5. The Hunter's Return. 3 weeks after the cabin fire, Riverside Heights had moved on from the tragic death of Antonio Noble. The local newspaper ran a tasteful obituary describing a security consultant who died in an accidental fire while visiting friends. His widow, Amber, was reportedly too grief-stricken to speak to reporters, while his son Anthony had thrown himself into his police training with renewed dedication. Chief Frank McCarthy had personally eulogized Antonio at the memorial service, speaking eloquently about the dangers faced by men who lived on society's edge. The performance was flawless, the concerned friend and mentor, supporting a grieving family through their darkest hour. What none of them knew was that the ghost of Antonio Noble was watching from the cemetery's edge, studying their faces, cataloging their tells, and planning their destruction with scientific precision. The safe house Control had provided was a modest apartment overlooking the police station, rented under a cover identity as thorough as any the CIA had ever created. From his surveillance post, Antonio could watch McCarthy's daily routines, track his movements, and intercept his communications without ever being seen. The intelligence picture that emerged was even worse than Control's initial briefing. McCarthy's trafficking operation wasn't just about money, it was about power. He'd systematically corrupted half the police department, blackmailed 3 city council members, and turned the mayor into a puppet through carefully orchestrated scandals. Amber's role went beyond providing safe houses. Her real estate connections had allowed the trafficking ring to move victims through a network of properties across 4 states. She wasn't just an accomplice. She was a key operational asset, smart enough to maintain plausible deniability while managing complex logistics. But it was Anthony who broke Antonio's heart and hardened his resolve. Surveillance revealed that his son had become McCarthy's most trusted lieutenant, personally recruiting other young officers into the corruption network and handling enforcement duties that left 2 people hospitalized and 1 permanently missing. The boy Antonio had raised to believe in justice had become an enforcer for criminals who sold human beings like cattle. On a Tuesday morning, Antonio put his plan into motion. The first target was Willie Metcalf, a low-level trafficker who used his auto repair shop as a transfer point for McCarthy's operation. Antonio had studied Metcalf's routines for a week, noting his morning arrival pattern and the 20-minute window when the shop was empty except for Metcalf himself. Antonio entered through the back door like smoke, his presence undetected until Metcalf found himself face down on his own workbench with a gun pressed against the base of his skull. "Good morning, Willie," Antonio said conversationally. "I understand you've been helping Frank McCarthy with some extracurricular activities." "Who the hell?" Metcalf's protest died as Antonio's free hand found a pressure point that sent lightning through his nervous system. "I'm someone who's very interested in your business model," Antonio continued. "Specifically, the part where you help transport human cargo. Now, you're going to tell me everything about McCarthy's operation, or I'm going to demonstrate why they used to call me the surgeon in certain circles." 20 minutes later, Metcalf had provided names, dates, locations, and financial details that Control's team would find very useful. As a bonus, he'd also revealed the location of a major shipment scheduled for that weekend. 18 young women being moved from a warehouse outside Richmond to buyers in New York. "What happens to me now?" Metcalf asked, his voice shaking. "You're going to take a vacation," Antonio replied. "Far away from here. Because if I see you again, if I hear you've contacted McCarthy, if you even think about warning them, I'll revisit our conversation with less pleasant tools." To ensure compliance, Antonio left Metcalf with a small gift, photos of every member of the man's family, taken with telephoto lenses that proved Antonio could reach them anywhere, anytime. The message was clear without being spoken. The second target was Kelvin Boyle, one of the police officers Anthony had recruited into McCarthy's network. Boyle lived alone in an apartment complex where sound dampening made private conversations possible. Antonio was waiting in Boyle's kitchen when the corrupt officer returned from his shift, sitting calmly at the table with a cup of coffee and Boyle's service weapon disassembled before him. "Officer Boyle," Antonio said as the younger man stopped dead in his doorway. "Please sit down. We need to discuss your career choices." You're supposed to be dead," Boyle stammered, recognizing Antonio from the memorial service photos. "Death, as it turns out, was greatly exaggerated. Your friend McCarthy made several critical errors in his planning. The most significant was assuming I wouldn't have contingencies in place." Over the next hour, Boyle provided detailed intelligence about the police department's corruption, McCarthy's protection methods, and Anthony's specific role in the operation. When Antonio was finished, Boyle was convinced that his only chance of survival lay in complete cooperation. "You're going to be my inside source," Antonio explained as he reassembled Boyle's weapon with mechanical precision. "You'll continue your normal duties, but now you'll report everything to me. And Officer Boyle, if you're thinking about warning McCarthy, remember that I died once already. Dead men have no legal constraints on their actions." By the end of the week, Antonio had systematically penetrated McCarthy's entire network. 3 more operatives had been turned, 2 had fled the state, and 1 had suffered an unfortunate accident that looked remarkably like a suicide brought on by gambling debts. The trafficking operation was beginning to fracture, but McCarthy hadn't yet realized he was under attack. In his arrogance, the police chief attributed the recent problems to bad luck and operational stress. He was about to learn that some enemies came bearing gifts wrapped in his own sins. Chapter 6. The Noose Titans. The warehouse raid happened exactly as Willie Metcalf had described. FBI agents, acting on an anonymous tip, descended on the Richmond facility like avenging angels. 18 young women were liberated, 3 traffickers were arrested, and enough evidence was seized to dismantle half of McCarthy's operation. From his surveillance post, Antonio watched Chief Frank McCarthy pace his office like a caged animal, fielding increasingly frantic phone calls from partners who wanted answers he didn't have. The carefully constructed empire was collapsing, and McCarthy was beginning to suspect he had a serious problem. What McCarthy didn't know was that the problem had a name, and it was hunting him with the patience of a predator who'd learned his craft in places where mistakes meant death. Antonio's next move was more psychological than tactical. Using his network of turned assets, he began feeding McCarthy false information. Hints that the FBI investigation was broader than expected, suggestions that someone in his inner circle was cooperating with federal agents, whispers that his operation had been penetrated at the highest levels. Paranoia was a weapon Antonio had wielded before, and he watched with professional satisfaction as McCarthy began turning on his own people. 3 corrupt officers were transferred to desk duty. 2 civilian accomplices were cut out of operations entirely. Even Anthony found himself under increased scrutiny from his mentor, a development that clearly confused and hurt the young man. Meanwhile, Antonio was preparing the more personal aspects of his revenge. Through his surveillance network, he'd learned that Amber had moved into McCarthy's house under the pretense of needing comfort during her grief. The reality was more calculating. She was helping manage the financial aspects of the trafficking operation, using her real estate license to launder money through property transactions. The house itself was a fortress of suburban respectability, gated community, private security, neighbors who valued their privacy and paid well for it. Breaking in would require careful planning and perfect timing. Antonio chose a Thursday evening when McCarthy was attending a community policing forum and Anthony was working the night shift. Through Kelvin Boyle, he'd confirmed that Amber would be alone, working on what she believed were legitimate real estate files, but were actually financial records for the trafficking network. The security system was sophisticated but not military-grade. Antonio bypassed it in under 3 minutes, using techniques that would have impressed his old instructors. He made his way through the house like a shadow, noting defensive positions, escape routes, and the locations of hidden weapons he was certain McCarthy had placed throughout the home. Amber was in the study, bent over a laptop computer, wearing reading glasses that made her look like the suburban housewife she'd once been. For a moment, seeing her there, Antonio felt an echo of the love he'd once carried for this woman. Then he remembered the chain around his legs and the smell of smoke filling his lungs, and the echo died. "Hello, Amber." She spun in her chair, her face cycling through shock, fear, and something that might have been relief before settling on a mask of false calm. "You're supposed to be dead," she said, her voice steadier than he'd expected. Disappointed? Confused? "The fire, we saw the body." "You saw what I wanted you to see," Antonio replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you know the truth?" For a long moment, they stared at each other across the space that had once been filled with shared dreams and mutual trust. Now it was a battlefield where words would be weapons and truth would be the final casualty. "Frank will kill you," Amber said finally. When he finds out you're alive, he'll make sure you disappear permanently. Frank is going to try, Antonio agreed. But Frank has made the critical error of fighting an enemy he doesn't understand. He thinks he's dealing with a suburban security consultant. He has no idea what he's actually awakened. And what's that? Antonio leaned forward, letting her see the cold calculation in his eyes, the complete absence of the man she'd once claimed to love. Something that should have stayed buried, he said. Something that knows exactly how many ways a human body can be broken, how many ways a person can disappear, and how many people I can destroy before anyone even realizes the hunt has begun. Amber's composure finally cracked. What do you want? Information. Names. Financial records. Bank account numbers. Every detail of McCarthy's operation, including your role in facilitating human trafficking. I don't know what you're talking about. Antonio pulled out his phone and showed her a series of photographs. Amber showing properties to known traffickers, meeting with money launderers, signing documents that had facilitated the movement of dozens of victims. 18 young women, Amber. 18 human beings you helped transport like cargo. Did you sleep well, knowing what you were enabling? Did you think about them when you were spending the money? The fight went out of her then, her shoulders sagging under the weight of crimes she could no longer deny. It wasn't supposed to be like that, she whispered. Frank said it was just financial consulting. I didn't know about what they were really doing. But you found out, didn't you? And you stayed. You chose money over conscience, chose Frank over your own family. You were never here. The words exploded out of her with desperate fury. Always traveling, always disappearing for weeks at a time. I was alone, Antonio, lonely and scared, and you were never here when I needed you. So you decided to kill me. Frank said you were dangerous. That meant like you never really retire, just find new targets. He showed me your files, the things you'd done. I was terrified of you, Antonio. Terrified of what you might do to us if you ever snapped. Antonio studied his wife's face, searching for any trace of the woman he'd married. What he found instead was a stranger who'd constructed an elaborate justification for betrayal and murder. Give me the information I want, he said, his voice carrying the finality of a death sentence. Every detail of McCarthy's operation. Every contact, every financial account, every location you've provided. Give me all of it, and maybe you'll live long enough to see a courtroom instead of a grave. For the next 2 hours, Amber Noble systematically destroyed her lover's criminal empire, providing details that would allow Antonio to dismantle every aspect of McCarthy's operation. When she was finished, Antonio had enough information to destroy not just the trafficking network, but the corrupt police officials, the money launderers, and the legitimate businesses that had provided cover for the operation. What happens now? Amber asked as Antonio prepared to leave. Now you disappear, he said. Pack a bag, empty your bank accounts, and run. Because when Frank realizes what you've done, he'll want to eliminate the loose end. And when Anthony learns the truth about what his mother has become, he'll have to choose between family and his mentor. Where will I go? Antonio paused at the door, looking back at the woman who'd once been the center of his world. That's not my concern anymore. You made your choices, Amber. Now you get to live with the consequences. As he vanished back into the night, Antonio felt no satisfaction, no sense of closure. Only the cold certainty that the final phase of his revenge was about to begin, and when it was over, everyone who'd betrayed him would understand exactly what they'd awakened when they'd tried to burn him alive. The hunter was coming home. Chapter 7. The Web Unravels. Frank McCarthy's world began collapsing on a Monday morning when FBI agents arrested 3 of his most trusted officers during shift change. By noon, federal prosecutors had unsealed indictments against 17 people connected to the trafficking operation. By evening, McCarthy's carefully constructed empire was hemorrhaging assets, allies, and secrets. From his surveillance post, Antonio watched the police chief's increasingly desperate attempts to control the damage. Phone calls were made to lawyers, contingency plans were activated, and threats were issued to subordinates who might consider cooperation with federal authorities. What McCarthy didn't realize was that the investigation had been guided by detailed intelligence provided by someone who knew every aspect of his operation. Intelligence that painted a complete picture of corruption stretching back 5 years. The first crack in McCarthy's composure came when he discovered that Amber had disappeared. Her house was empty, her bank accounts closed, and her cell phone disconnected. To the outside world, It appeared that grief had finally overwhelmed the widow of Antonio Noble, driving her to start fresh somewhere far from painful memories. The reality was more complex. Following Antonio's visit, Amber had liquidated everything she could and fled to a cabin in Montana under an assumed identity, hoping distance would protect her from both her former lover's wrath and her husband's vengeance. She was wrong on both counts. The second crack came when Anthony Noble requested an emergency meeting with his mentor. The young officer had noticed irregularities in his assignments, witnessed conversations that ended abruptly when he approached, and sensed a growing tension that no one would explain. Antonio monitored their conversation through surveillance equipment placed in McCarthy's office, listening as his son finally began asking the right questions. "Chief, I need to understand what's happening," Anthony said, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned from McCarthy himself. "3 arrests this morning, all from our unit. The FBI is asking questions about operations I helped coordinate. Are we under investigation?" McCarthy leaned back in his chair, studying the young man he'd carefully cultivated for over a year. "Sometimes, Anthony, good officers get caught up in situations beyond their control. The important thing is loyalty, knowing who your real family is." "My real family." Anthony's confusion was audible even through the electronic surveillance. "You mean the department?" "I mean the people who've invested in your future, who've shown you what real police work looks like, who've given you opportunities your father never could." The manipulation was masterful, Antonio had to admit. McCarthy was preparing Anthony for the choice that was coming: loyalty to his mentor or loyalty to abstract concepts like law and justice. "What about my mother?" Anthony asked. "She's disappeared. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. Her house is empty. Did something happen to her?" "Your mother made some difficult choices," McCarthy replied carefully. "Choices that put her at odds with certain federal investigations. She's safer where she is." "You know where she is?" "I know she's protected. Just like you'll be protected, as long as you remember where your loyalties lie." Antonio could hear his son processing this information, trying to reconcile the caring mentor he'd known with the implications of what he was hearing. The cognitive dissonance was audible in Anthony's voice when he spoke again. "Chief, are you telling me that my mother is involved in whatever the FBI is investigating?" "I'm telling you that families are complicated, Anthony. Blood doesn't always determine loyalty. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who betray us." The irony wasn't lost on Antonio. McCarthy was speaking truth while simultaneously embodying the very betrayal he described. The man who'd corrupted Anthony was now warning him about the dangers of misplaced trust. "I need some time to think," Anthony said, and Antonio could hear his son's world beginning to fracture. "Of course. But remember, Anthony, in situations like this, hesitation can be dangerous. Sometimes you have to choose sides quickly before the choice is made for you." After Anthony left, McCarthy made a series of phone calls that confirmed Antonio's assessment of the man's desperation. The police chief was activating elimination protocols, calling in favors from people who handled problems permanently. The final phase was beginning. That evening, Antonio put his own endgame into motion. Using the financial intelligence Amber had provided, he systematically destroyed McCarthy's remaining assets. Bank accounts were frozen through federal warrants, real estate holdings were seized as potential crime scene evidence, and legitimate businesses that had provided cover for the operation found themselves under intense scrutiny from regulatory agencies. But money was only part of McCarthy's power. The man's real strength lay in his network of corrupt officials, criminal contacts, and the carefully maintained image of a reformist police chief. All of these would require more personal attention. The first target was Stanley Greer, the mayor who'd provided political cover for McCarthy's activities in exchange for help managing his own scandals. Antonio found Greer in his private study, enjoying an evening scotch while reviewing campaign finance reports. "Mr. Mayor," Antonio said as he materialized from the shadows near Greer's bookshelf. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Greer's scotch glass shattered on the hardwood floor. But the fire? We attended your memorial service. Touching ceremony. I particularly appreciated Chief McCarthy's eulogy. Very heartfelt for a man who'd just committed murder." For the next hour, Antonio extracted a detailed confession from Greer regarding his role in facilitating McCarthy's corruption. The mayor had provided inside information about federal investigations, delayed city council votes that would have increased police oversight, and even helped launder money through municipal contracts. When Antonio was finished, Greer was convinced that his only chance of survival lay in complete cooperation with federal authorities. The mayor would be calling the FBI within hours, providing evidence that would prove McCarthy's corruption extended into the highest levels of city government. The second target was Paul Heath, McCarthy's connection to the trafficking network's financial operations. Heath had been careful to maintain plausible deniability, structuring his involvement through shell companies and intermediary transactions. Antonio found Heath at his private office, working late on what appeared to be damage control. The man's face went white when he recognized the supposedly dead security consultant standing in his doorway. "Mr. Heath," Antonio said conversationally, "I understand you've been handling some interesting investment opportunities for Chief McCarthy." By midnight, Heath had provided complete financial records for the trafficking operation, including bank account numbers in 3 countries and the names of every person involved in moving money for McCarthy's network. As Antonio prepared to leave, Heath asked the question that had been burning in his eyes throughout their conversation. "What are you?" "I'm the consequence of betrayal," Antonio replied. "I'm what happens when you try to destroy someone without understanding what they're capable of becoming." By dawn, Frank McCarthy's criminal empire was in full collapse. Federal agents were seizing assets, corrupt officials were negotiating plea deals, and the trafficking network was fragmenting as participants fled or sought immunity. But Antonio wasn't finished. The most personal aspects of his revenge were yet to come, and they would require direct confrontation with the 2 people who'd hurt him most deeply: his wife and his son. Chapter 8: Blood and Judgment. The safe house where Amber Noble had sought refuge was a rustic cabin in the Montana wilderness, accessible only by a winding dirt road that added 20 minutes to any journey. She'd chosen the location for its isolation, believing that distance would protect her from the consequences of her betrayal. She was watching the morning news when the first reports of McCarthy's arrest appeared on screen. The anchor's voice was professionally neutral as she described the early morning raid on the police chief's home, the federal charges being filed, and the wider investigation into human trafficking that had already netted 17 arrests. Amber's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the cabin's wooden floor. On screen, McCarthy's perp walk was a study in fallen arrogance. The man who'd promised her protection and a new life was now wearing handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. She was reaching for her phone to call her sister when she heard the sound that confirmed her worst fears: a helicopter approaching through the mountain air. Through the cabin window, she watched the aircraft settle into the clearing where she'd parked her rental car. 2 figures emerged, one she didn't recognize, and one who'd haunted her nightmares since the night she'd watched him supposedly burn to death. Antonio Noble walked toward the cabin with unhurried steps, his posture relaxed but predatory. Behind him, the stranger, a man with military bearing and cold eyes, maintained overwatch position with the casual competence of someone accustomed to violence. Amber considered running, but the cabin's location made escape impossible. She considered the pistol she'd purchased for protection, but knew it would be useless against someone with Antonio's training. In the end, she simply waited, standing in the cabin's main room like a condemned woman facing execution. Antonio entered without knocking, his presence filling the space with tangible menace. He'd changed since their last meeting. The suburban consultant facade was completely gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "Hello, Amber," he said, settling into the chair across from where she stood. "Enjoying the news?" "You destroyed him," she whispered. "Frank trusted me, and you used that to destroy everything he built." "I destroyed a criminal organization that trafficked human beings," Antonio corrected. "The fact that your lover was at the center of it is simply justice." "He wasn't," she began, then stopped. The denial sounded hollow even to her own ears. 18 women, Amber. 18 lives destroyed by the operation you helped facilitate. Did you think about them when you were planning my murder? Did their suffering factor into your calculations at all? Amber sank into a chair, the weight of accumulated guilt finally breaking through her carefully constructed rationalizations. "I didn't know. Not at first. By the time I understood what was really happening, it was too late to leave." "Too profitable to leave, you mean?" "You don't understand. Frank showed me your files, Antonio. The things you've done, the people you've killed. I was terrified of what you might do to us if you ever decided we were threats." Antonio studied his wife's face, searching for any trace of the woman he'd once loved. What he found was a stranger who'd chosen fear over trust, money over morality, and murder over marriage. "So you decided to strike first," he said. "Eliminate the threat before it could eliminate you. I thought it was self-defense. And our son? Was corrupting Anthony also self-defense?" Amber's composure cracked completely. Anthony made his own choices. Frank didn't force him to do anything. Frank manipulated a young man's sense of justice and turned him into an accessory to human trafficking. Our son's hands are now stained with crimes that will destroy his life even if he avoids prison. "You can help him," Amber said desperately. "You have contacts, resources. You can make this go away for Anthony." Antonio felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, but a kind of finality that made further conversation pointless. "Anthony chose his side when he put those chains around my legs," he said. "When he smiled as he watched me burn. When he called me a loser who deserved to die. He made his choice, Amber. Now he gets to live with the consequences. He's your son. He was my son. Now he's something else, a young man who chose corruption over family, who participated in human trafficking, who tried to murder his own father. That person deserves exactly as much mercy as he showed me." Amber began to cry then, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. "What do you want from me, Antonio? What can I do to make this right?" "Nothing," he replied with complete certainty. "There is nothing you can do, nothing you can say, nothing you can offer that will balance the scales of what you've done. You chose to destroy our family for money and a man who saw you as nothing more than a useful tool. So you're going to kill me." Antonio considered the question with clinical detachment. 3 weeks ago, the answer would have been yes. But watching Amber break down in this remote cabin, he realized that death would be too quick, too merciful. "No," he said finally. "I'm going to let you live with the knowledge of what you've become. Frank is going to federal prison for life. Anthony is facing charges that will destroy any chance of the career he wanted. And you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing that you chose to destroy everything good in your life for a man who never loved you and money that can't buy you peace." Antonio stood, preparing to leave. "The FBI will find this location within the week. I suggest you have a good lawyer ready." As he reached the door, Amber called out one last time. "What about us, Antonio? What about the love we had?" He paused, looking back at the woman who'd once been the center of his world. "That love died in a burning cabin, Amber. What you're looking at now is just its ghost, making sure the debts are paid." The helicopter lifted off into the Montana sky, carrying Antonio away from the last vestige of his old life. Behind him, Amber Noble sat alone in a cabin that had become her prison, waiting for federal agents to arrive and complete the destruction of everything she'd tried to build on the foundation of betrayal. But Antonio's work wasn't finished. One last confrontation remained, with the person whose betrayal had cut deepest of all. Chapter 9, The Final Reckoning. Anthony Noble stood in the ruins of Chief McCarthy's office, staring at federal agents who were systematically dismantling everything he believed in. File cabinets were being emptied, computers seized, and evidence bags filled with documents that painted his mentor as the leader of a criminal conspiracy. For 3 days, Anthony had tried to make sense of the chaos. McCarthy's arrest, his mother's disappearance, the growing realization that the police department he'd dreamed of joining was rotten to its core. Every conversation he'd had with his mentor now carried new, sinister implications. Every assignment he'd been given required re-examination through the lens of criminal conspiracy. He was alone in the office when Antonio appeared in the doorway like a figure from a nightmare. Anthony's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, then stopped as he remembered who he was facing. "Hello, son," Antonio said, his voice carrying no warmth, no trace of paternal affection. "You're supposed to be dead," Anthony whispered, the words barely audible. "So I've been told." Repeatedly, in fact. Antonio entered the office and closed the door behind him, the sound carrying a finality that made Anthony's blood run cold. "How long have you known?" Anthony asked, sinking into McCarthy's chair as if the weight of realization was too much to bear standing. "Known what? That my wife was having an affair? That she was helping traffic human beings? That my son had become an accessory to human trafficking? Or that all 3 of you were planning to murder me?" Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Anthony had spent the last 3 days trying to maintain his sense of righteousness, to find some way to justify his actions. Now, facing his father's cold certainty, those justifications crumbled. Chief McCarthy showed me your files, Anthony said desperately. The things you've done, the people you've killed. You're a monster, Dad. We were protecting ourselves from a monster. By becoming monsters yourselves? By stopping you before you could hurt innocent people. Antonio laughed, the sound devoid of humor. Innocent people? Like the 18 women you helped transport? Like the families destroyed by McCarthy's trafficking operation? Tell me, Anthony, exactly which innocent people were you protecting? Anthony's composure finally shattered. I didn't know. Not about the trafficking, not about what Frank was really doing. I thought I was serving justice. You thought you were serving your own sense of superiority, Antonio corrected. You thought you were better than your father, smarter than the man who raised you. You bought into McCarthy's manipulation because it felt good to believe you were the hero of your own story. I was trying to be a good cop. You were trying to be Frank McCarthy. And now you know what Frank McCarthy really was. A criminal who used his badge to facilitate human trafficking, who corrupted young officers like you to maintain his operation, who convinced you to participate in the murder of your own father. Anthony buried his face in his hands, the weight of his choices finally becoming clear. What happens now? Now you face the consequences of your decisions, Antonio replied. The FBI has evidence of your involvement in McCarthy's operation. Your police career is over. Your life as you imagined it is finished. Will you help me? Testify that I was manipulated, that I didn't understand what was really happening. Antonio studied his son with the same clinical detachment he'd once reserved for enemy targets. You stood outside that cabin and watched me burn. You smiled when you thought I was going to die. You called me a loser who deserved death. Why would I help someone who felt that way about his own father? Because I'm your son. No, Antonio said with absolute finality. My son would never have put chains around my legs. My son would never have participated in human trafficking. My son would never have tried to murder me for insurance money. He paused, letting the words settle. I don't know who you are, Anthony, but you're not my son. My son died the day you chose Frank McCarthy over your own family. Anthony began to cry then, not the tears of a child seeking comfort, but the desperate sobs of a young man who'd finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. I can change, he pleaded. I can make this right. Be the son you wanted me to be. The time for that passed when you lit the match, Antonio replied. Some choices can't be undone, Anthony. Some betrayals can't be forgiven. You chose your path when you chose to see me as an enemy rather than a father. Antonio moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at the young man who'd once carried his name and his hopes for the future. Frank McCarthy is going to federal prison for life, he said. Your mother is facing charges that will destroy whatever life she thought she was building. And you're going to spend the next several years in prison, thinking about the choices that brought you here. What about you, Dad? What happens to you? Antonio considered the question. The man who'd entered that burning cabin was dead, the suburban security consultant, the hopeful father, the husband who'd believed in family loyalty. What remained was something older and harder, something that belonged in shadows rather than suburbs. I disappear, he said simply. Antonio Noble dies in that cabin, and something else walks away. Something that understands the real nature of the world and the price of betrayal. As Antonio reached for the door handle, Anthony called out one last time. Do you hate me? Antonio paused, his hand on the door. For a moment, he was tempted to offer comfort, to provide some small measure of paternal forgiveness. Then he remembered the smell of smoke and the weight of chains, and the moment passed. I don't feel anything for you at all, he said. Hate requires emotional investment. You're just a stranger who happens to share my DNA. A stranger who made the mistake of betraying someone he should have feared. The door closed with a soft click, and Anthony Noble was left alone with the wreckage of his choices and the echoing emptiness of a father's love withdrawn forever. 6 months later, former police chief Frank McCarthy was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The human trafficking operation he'd led had been completely dismantled, with 17 co-conspirators receiving sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. Amber Noble pled guilty to conspiracy charges and received 12 years in federal prison. Her real estate license was revoked, her assets seized, and her dreams of a new life with McCarthy reduced to ashes. Anthony Noble was sentenced to 8 years for his role in the trafficking operation. His police academy graduation ring was returned to the institution that had trained him, along with a letter explaining why his name would be removed from all honor rolls and alumni records. The man who had once been Antonio Noble simply vanished. Federal records showed him killed in an accidental fire, and no one questioned the convenient resolution to a case involving classified material and dangerous international connections. Somewhere in the shadows where predators hunt other predators, something moved with purpose and precision. It had no name, no address, no family to betray it. It existed only to balance scales and collect debts from those who believed themselves beyond judgment. The suburban life was over. The hunt would never end. And in the darkness between what people believed and what they feared, justice wore 1,000 faces, all of them watching, all of them waiting, all of them remembering the price of betrayal. The fire had burned away everything soft and trusting, leaving only the essential truth. Some men are too dangerous to betray, and some betrayals are too deep to survive. The lesson would be remembered by everyone who'd witnessed its teaching, forever. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.